The chill of the late October air bit through the thin wool of my coat, carrying the metallic scent of damp stone and the exhaust fumes of a city that never truly slept. I hurried my pace, the leather soles of my sensible low boots clicking a nervous rhythm against the cobblestones of the old university district. It was past 11, and the streetlights here were fewer, casting pools of sickly amber that dissolved into vast, brooding stretches of shadow. My tutoring session had run late, and the weight of my satchel, filled with marked papers and the anxieties of 10-year-olds, felt suddenly heavy, burdensome. I rounded the corner past the sepulchral silence of the abandoned library, instinctively shrinking toward the brick wall. That was when the air thickened. It wasn't the cold, but a sudden, suffocating presence. Before my mind could register the threat, a heavy hand clamped over my mouth, the stench of stale tobacco and something sour filling my nostrils. The world tilted violently. I gasped, swallowing dust and terror as I was slammed against the unforgiving brick. The satchel dropped, scattering papers into the alley's filth. I fought, small, desperate movements against a brute force that felt boundless. My elbow connected with something hard, earning me a sharp, punishing blow to the head that sent stars exploding behind my eyes. Then I was on the ground, the cold, gritty asphalt scraping my cheek. A crushing weight settled over my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs in ragged, futile puffs. Panic, sharp and black, eclipsed all thought. I could only see the shadow above me, hear the labored breathing, feel the inexorable pressure. No air! I need air! My hands clawed uselessly at the rough fabric of his jacket. The world was shrinking to the ragged sound of my own failing breath and the terrible, grinding certainty that this was how it ended, beneath a faceless shadow in a forgotten alley. Then the weight vanished, not lifted, but flung. The sudden void left me gasping, curled into a defensive ball, my ears ringing violently. The silence was instantly replaced by a sound far worse than the struggle, the wet, sickening impact of bone on stone, followed by a grunt of sheer, elemental pain that was not my own. The air crackled with a fury that felt cosmic, terrifyingly focused. I pushed myself weakly onto my elbows, my vision swimming. All I could perceive was a whirlwind of dark motion, a silhouette taller and broader than my attacker had been, moving with a controlled violence that defied physics. It was a dance of absolute authority, swift and final. There was a dull thud, the sound of a body hitting the ground and staying there, and then, mercifully, silence. The whirlwind stopped. My rescuer stood over me, his back to the faint light, a massive, unmoving sentinel. Agonizingly, I tilted my head back, tracing the line of his tailored suit, the breadth of his shoulders, until my gaze finally reached his face. The shadows were deep, but the ambient light caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the severe cut of his cheekbones, and the unforgiving curve of his mouth. But it was the eyes that stopped my heart. They were obsidian black, intense, and utterly devoid of mercy, fixed on the crumpled form of my attacker. When they finally shifted, locking onto mine, the cold fury did not diminish, but it was abruptly contained, banked into a dangerous, searing focus. The years dissolved. Dante Moretti. Ilara. His voice was a low, rough rumble, far deeper and colder than I remembered, yet the inflection of my name was unmistakable. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of proprietary recognition, heavy with years and unspoken history. A shudder ran through me, part relief, part primal fear of the man he had become, the man who ruled the shadows, the name whispered in the darkest corners of the city. He knelt, the movement fluid and unnervingly graceful for such a large man. He didn't ask if I was hurt, didn't offer platitudes. His hand, large and gloved, reached out, not to touch, but to hover, as if waiting for permission I was too broken to grant. My bruised body trembled, but something deeper, a terrifying, magnetic draw, rooted me to the spot. Did he touch you? The question was soft, yet the underlying menace was so profound it made the air vibrate. I could only shake my head weakly, trying to push past the throbbing behind my eyes. I know him, I whispered, the words scraping my throat. Liam. He works for the city, the transit authority. He saw me tutoring late. Dante's eyes narrowed fractionally, absorbing the name like a predator marking its territory. A cold, dangerous calm settled over him, more terrifying than his fury. He didn't look at Liam again. He only looked at me. You are not safe here. Before I could form a protest, his arm slid beneath my shoulders and his other beneath my knees. He lifted me effortlessly, cradling me against the warmth of his chest. The smell of his cologne, rich, dark, and expensive, was a stark contrast to the alley's filth. I felt the powerful, steady beat of his heart beneath my ear, a rhythm of survival that immediately quelled the hysterical fluttering of my own. I was being carried, lifted from the brutal reality of the street and into the sphere of his lethal protection. I should have been terrified of the mafia boss, the monster they whispered about. But in that moment, weak and defenseless, the only thing I felt was the horrifying, undeniable security of being held by a man who had just demonstrated he would shatter the world for my sake. The journey was a blur of dark, tinted glass and silent power. We ascended quickly, the elevator gliding with a whisper of hydraulics, leaving the city lights far below. When the doors opened, I was deposited onto a floor so high it felt like the inside of a cloud. The penthouse was vast, silent, and overwhelmingly luxurious, all polished mahogany, black velvet, and windows stretching from floor to vaulted ceiling, overlooking the sprawling, indifferent metropolis. He set me gently onto a chaise lounge of dark, supple leather. The room was illuminated softly, bathing the space in a brooding sepia light. Dante stood back, removing his gloves with deliberate, slow movements, his eyes never leaving my face. He looked like a masterpiece of lethal architecture, perfectly composed, yet vibrating with restrained energy. "You are safe now, Elara," he stated, his voice stripped of all emotion, professional and final. "Nothing touches what belongs to me." I met his gaze, my heart hammering a violent tattoo against my ribs. I wasn't just safe, I was trapped. And as I stared into the eyes of the man who had traded his innocence for a kingdom, I understood that the compassion I had shown a wounded boy years ago was now the weight of an eternal debt being paid in shadow and obsession. The first sensation was the dull, pervasive ache that pulsed beneath my skin, centered above my temple and radiating outward through every exhausted fiber. It was the heavy, insistent reminder that the violence of the night before had not been a nightmare, but a brutal reality. When I finally forced my eyelids open, I was met not by the familiar, threadbare comfort of my own small apartment, but by a sepulchral silence and the overwhelming presence of wealth. I lay cocooned in sheets of heavy, cool silk beneath a duvet so plush it felt like being submerged in a cloud. The air smelled of polished mahogany and a faint, sharp scent of antiseptic that suggested I had been tended to. The room was immense, a cathedral of shadow and light, dominated by a four-poster bed carved from dark, brooding wood. The windows were vast, stretching toward a vaulted ceiling detailed with intricate, gilded molding. It was a beautiful, suffocating space, a gilded cage built for a queen, or perhaps a captive. I shifted, testing the limits of my pain. My ribs protested, and I touched the throbbing spot on my head, finding a neat, small bandage. My clothes had been replaced by a soft, long camise that felt alien against my skin. The vulnerability of having been undressed and tended to while unconscious sent a fresh wave of heat through my cheeks, quickly chased by the cold dread of my situation. My gaze swept the room, locating the sentinel. Dante was standing by the immense floor-to-ceiling window, framed by the pale, bruised light of the pre-dawn city. He wasn't looking at the skyline he commanded. He was looking at me. He wore a fresh suit, black as midnight, perfectly tailored to his formidable frame. He hadn't slept, or if he had, the rest had done nothing to soften the severe lines of his face. He was an immovable statue of vigilance, radiating a contained, dangerous energy. He saw my eyes open and moved instantly, his steps soundless on the thick Persian rug. There was a predatory grace in his motion, an economy of movement that spoke of constant readiness. He stopped several feet from the bed, his presence instantly shrinking the enormous room. "Ilara," he said, the sound low, the rough texture of his voice scraping against the polished silence. "How do you feel?" I swallowed, the dryness in my throat making the effort difficult. "Sore, confused. You are safe. That is all that matters." He didn't sound like he was offering comfort. He sounded like he was issuing a decree. His eyes, the color of wet slate, searched mine with an unnerving intensity, demanding more than a polite reply. He reached out slowly, his large hand brushing aside a stray strand of hair from my forehead. The contact was brief, yet it was an electric shock, a possessive gesture that felt inexorable and absolute. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the powerful, visceral reality of him. "We need the details," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow held more authority than a shout. "You mentioned a name in the alley. Liam. Who is he, exactly?" I looked at the man standing over me. This was the feared Dante Moretti, the king of the city's shadows, who could conjure violence with a mere flicker of his attention. Yet, beneath the tailored facade and the lethal reputation, I still saw the panicked, wounded boy I had once sheltered, desperate for a kindness he hadn't known existed. I had to trust that boy still lived somewhere beneath the veneer of the monster. The memory of the attack, the crushing weight, the sheer terror rushed back, making my breath hitch. I closed my eyes briefly, gathering the courage to speak. He's Liam Crowley. He works for the City Transit Authority, near the old municipal library branch. I see him sometimes when I tutor late. He sometimes drives the service truck. He knew my routine. My voice was thin, reedy, betraying the lingering shock. Dante remained motionless, absorbing the information. The silence that followed stretched tautly, humming with unspoken power. It wasn't the silence of contemplation, but the awful stillness that precedes a storm. I watched his jaw clench, the muscle near his temple twitching almost imperceptibly. The banked fury I had witnessed in the alley began to gather again, but this time it was colder, sharper, honed by strategy. Crowley, he repeated, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. He didn't ask why Crowley had done it. For him, the why was irrelevant. The who was the only necessary data point for the inevitable action. I tried to reach for him, a desperate conciliatory gesture, but my hand fell back onto the silk. Dante, please. He's just a terrible man who saw an opportunity. Don't. He cut me off, not with a word, but with the sheer force of his glare. The obsidian in his eyes solidified, transforming from intense focus into absolute, terrifying certainty. He looked not at Liam Crowley, but through him to the inevitable ruin awaiting him. He touched what is mine, Elara, he said, the possessive pronoun echoing the declaration from the night before, now imbued with lethal finality. He took air from your lungs. He caused you pain. He moved away, turning back toward the vast window, the city lights reflecting coldly in his eyes. He didn't need to elaborate. I didn't need to ask what he would do. The simplicity of my confession, a name, an employer, had just armed the most dangerous man in the city with a target. I watched his broad back, the tension in the set of his shoulders, and realized with a sickening lurch of fear and fascination, I hadn't just secured my own safety, I had ignited a firestorm that would consume anyone who dared to stand in Dante Moretti's path. I was bound to the king of the underworld, protected by a love that felt less like salvation and more like obsession. And as the dawn broke, painting the Gothic room with cold, bruised colors, I knew the city was about to learn the terrible cost of touching the gentle teacher Dante claimed as his own. The silence of the penthouse was the most unnerving sound of all. It was not a natural quiet, but a profound, engineered void, as if the very air had been sucked clean of friction and noise. 24 hours had passed since Dante had carried me from the filth of the alley and into this Gothic vault of polished stone and limitless wealth. Now, the high walls of my temporary prison seemed to amplify the absence of the city's usual roar, lending the atmosphere a sepulchral weight. I sat near the vast window in the adjacent sitting room, wrapped in a blanket of cashmere that felt impossibly soft. Below, the city sprawled under a weak, overcast sky. It looked the same, millions of lights, endless concrete, but it felt different, like a massive, restless beast that had suddenly been stunned into submission. I could sense the tension, a collective holding of breath that permeated the very foundations of the skyscrapers. A small antique television set, hidden discreetly within a carved mahogany cabinet, was tuned low. The local news anchor, usually brisk and cheerful, spoke with a nervous precision about unforeseen administrative shifts and unconfirmed law enforcement activities across the Municipal Transit Authority, Crowley's employer. The reports were vague, the details frustratingly opaque, yet the subtext was chillingly clear. The infrastructure of the city was subtly buckling under a pressure applied from the shadows. The price for touching me was already being exacted. A soft knock preceded the entry of a woman. She was middle-aged, dressed in crisp, black attire. Her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. She carried a silver tray bearing a delicate cup of steaming tea and a single piece of toast. She moved like a shadow, efficient and silent. When she placed the tray on the low table before me, her eyes flickered up, meeting mine for the briefest moment. In that instant, I saw it, not fear for herself, but a profound, almost reverent pity for me. I was the gentle thing that had been caught in the crosshairs of a monstrous power, and they treated me like sacred, dangerous cargo. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice sounding impossibly loud in the hushed room. She inclined her head, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible, and retreated without a word. Every member of Dante's staff, the silent men who stood sentinel near the elevators, the spectral housekeeper, carried the same aura of fearful, devoted service. They were ghosts in their own lives, moving only to fulfill the commands of their master. And their master, I knew, was currently engaged in an act of profound, city-wide vengeance. The guilt was a cold knot in my stomach. I had given him a name, and he had taken the permission to unleash the storm. I stood, the cashmere pooling around my feet, and sought him out. I found him in his office, a room of dark leather and formidable mahogany that felt more like a throne room than a workspace. He was on the phone, his back to the door, framed by the cold light of the windows. His voice was a low, steady current of authority, issuing instructions that I instinctively knew sealed destinies. He hung up the moment he sensed my presence, turning slowly. He was immaculate, a terrifying vision of control. His gaze, dark as polished obsidian, immediately fixed on my face, assessing my health, my fear, my position. The intensity of his focus was a physical weight. "You should be resting, Alara," he stated, crossing the room in 3 soundless strides. He stopped, not touching me, but dominating the space between us. "The news," I began, struggling to keep my voice level. "Dante, what have you done?" "The reports are vague, but the feeling, the city is terrified." His lips barely moved as he responded, his voice low and devoid of apology. "I have secured the perimeter. I told you, nothing touches what belongs to me." Crowley was the immediate threat, but he was not the only one who watches the streets. The world needed a reminder of the consequences. I felt a dizzying mix of moral repulsion and a horrifying rush of primal security. Consequences? You are talking about ruining lives, violence. Dante, please, you can't eradicate every man who works for the city transit. This is too much. He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek. His thumb rested just beneath my eye, tracing the fading bruise that marked the violence of the night before. His touch was warm, possessive, and infinitely careful, a paradox of tenderness held within a fist of steel. It made my breath catch, the fear and the forbidden attraction colliding in a painful surge. "It is not too much," he countered, his eyes burning into mine. "It is the minimum requirement." Every man who heard the whispers, who thought they might take advantage, who believed you were weak and unprotected, they must understand that the price for even looking at you is absolute ruin. I am not simply eliminating the threat, Elara. I am eliminating the possibility of a threat. His proximity was intoxicating, his ruthlessness a dark mirror reflecting the depth of his devotion. I knew, rationally, that the man standing before me was a monster, a king built on blood and fear. But that monster was entirely, terrifyingly focused on my safety, on creating a flawless, unbreachable shield around my fragile existence. He was the ghost of vengeance, and he was hunting for me. "You are building a wall of bodies," I whispered, the horror genuine, yet strangely muffled by the overwhelming security of his presence. "A foundation, then," he corrected, a cold, dangerous smile touching the severe line of his mouth. "And it will be strong enough to hold back the world. You are safe here, Ilara. You will always be safe here." His intensity shattered my ability to argue. My moral compass spun wildly, unable to reconcile the kind-hearted boy I remembered with the terrifying, obsessive man who now commanded the darkness. I should pull away, condemn his actions, run screaming from the gilded cage. Instead, I leaned fractionally into his touch, allowing the warmth of his skin to momentarily eclipse the cold dread of his power. I was drawn to the terrifying simplicity of his commitment, to the knowledge that for Dante Moretti, my survival was the only law that mattered. I was the gentle teacher, trapped by the devotion of a ruthless king. And as I stared into the uncompromising depths of his eyes, I realized the moral chasm between us was irrelevant. The force of his obsession was already inexorable, pulling me down into the beautiful, shadowed ruin he was creating in my name. The air in the penthouse, though perpetually filtered and climate-controlled, held a strange, sepulchral chill, the coldness of marble and unyielding stone. My body felt stronger now, the bruises fading to shades of yellow and green beneath the soft camise. With Dante occupied in his silent machinations, I allowed myself to tentatively explore the confines of my gilded cage, drawn by a restless curiosity that warred with my inherent caution. The architecture of this space was a contradiction, a visible manifestation of the man who ruled it. The vast windows and streamlined surfaces spoke of modern, ruthless efficiency and unbreachable security, the fortress of the present. But woven into this modernity were deep, ancient veins of inheritance, heavy, carved wainscoting, vaulted ceilings supported by columns that seemed to have been salvaged from a lost Roman villa, and fixtures of wrought iron twisted into morbid, beautiful geometries. It was Gothic romance married to a high-security bunker, a home designed by the architects of obsession. I drifted through a long gallery lined with portraits of severe, dark-eyed men and women, the Moretti lineage, I presumed, each face hinting at generations of calculated power. Their gazes followed me, silent witnesses to my presence here. I found myself drawn finally to a room set apart from the main living areas, a library or study that seemed to be the nerve center of his operations. The walls were lined not just with books, but with monitors displaying cryptic data, yet the dominating feature was a massive, antique desk. It was a relic of dark oak, scarred by time and use, its surface polished to a mirror sheen. It felt ancient and heavy, imbued with the weight of decisions made over centuries. I approached it slowly, feeling an almost illicit thrill at entering this sanctum. A tremor of residual terror passed through me as I thought of the commands issued from this spot, the fates sealed by Dante's hand. Tucked into a shadowed corner of the desk, beside a heavy bronze inkwell and a stack of leather-bound ledgers, was a single, small book. It was visibly distinct from the others, worn, the corners softened, its spine cracked. Drawn by its fragility, I reached for it. My fingers traced the title embossed in faded gold, Paradise Lost by John Milton. I opened the volume carefully. The scent of old paper and dust rose immediately, bringing with it a sudden, crushing sense of familiarity. And then I saw it, on the front flyleaf, penned in a childish, looping script that made my breath hitch. To the boy who needs reminding that even Satan fell from grace because he dared to hope for too much, be gentle to yourself. E.H. The initials were mine. The memory, a ghost I hadn't realized I was carrying, slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. 15 years ago. A desperate, frightened teenager with a bruised eye and an impossible weight on his shoulders, sitting in the dusty corner of the old community library, hiding from a world that had already demanded too much blood. I had been tutoring local kids, still full of naive compassion, and I had pressed this book into his hands, trying to offer something solid against the chaos I couldn't understand. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was the exact copy. He had kept it. He had kept me. I pressed the book against my chest, the reality of the situation clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The debt he claimed to be repaying was not a momentary gratitude. It was the foundation of his existence. He had built his kingdom, his fortress, and his entire ruthless persona around the ghost of the boy I had shown kindness to. You found it. Dante's voice, low and resonant, cut through the silence. I hadn't heard him enter. He stood in the doorway, framed by the dark mahogany, his expression unreadable, yet radiating an undeniable intensity. His eyes fixed instantly on the book clutched in my hands, a subtle shift in his demeanor acknowledging its significance. I turned, still holding the worn volume. The shame and the realization made my cheeks burn. "You kept it," I whispered, the words barely audible. He moved toward me, his pace measured, his presence growing more overwhelming with every step. He stopped just outside my personal sphere, but the air between us was suddenly thick, charged with the weight of years unacknowledged. "Why wouldn't I?" he countered, the question a low, dangerous rumble. It was the first kindness I had ever been shown that didn't come with a price attached. You saw me, Ilara, not the blood, not the filth, but the boy underneath. You gave me a map to the internal landscape, didn't you? He reached out, not to take the book, but to brush his fingers against the worn leather spine. The contact felt possessive, proprietary. His touch lingered, tracing the precise spot where my initials rested beneath the cover. "You said I needed to be gentle to myself," he continued, his gaze lifting to meet mine, the slate-gray depths burning with a fierce, almost painful clarity. But I learned quickly that gentleness is a luxury only those who command great strength can afford. Your compassion was the only anchor I had when I decided to build that strength. I learned to survive, and then I learned to conquer, always with the memory of that moment, of your hand, your voice as the blueprint. My throat tightened. This was not the language of a debtor. This was the confession of a man whose entire trajectory had been warped by a single, accidental act of grace. His protection wasn't a noble gesture. It was the inevitable culmination of a long-held fixation. "Dante, I was a girl trying to help a wounded stranger," I pleaded, trying to pull back from the terrifying precipice of his intensity. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what you would become." But you were the architect of the promise, he corrected, the severity of his tone brooking no argument. The promise that if I endured the darkness, there was something pure worth returning to. You were the light I was fighting to keep lit. And when I found you bruised and bleeding in that alley, the fragile memory I had guarded for so long was threatened. The structure of my entire world shifted. He lifted his hand, cupping my jaw, forcing me to hold his gaze. His thumb stroked my cheekbone, the gesture both tender and utterly dominating. I could feel the powerful heat of his body, the contained violence that existed just beneath the surface of his skin. You are not a debt, Ilara. You are the reason for the kingdom. You were the only thing I truly wanted to keep, even when I had nothing. Now I have everything, and that desire has only intensified. That attack was not just against you, it was against the foundation of my life, and I will burn the city to ashes before I allow the possibility of that threat to exist again. I felt a dizzying descent into the reality of his obsession. I was not just protected, I was possessed. I was the core of his dark, dangerous world, the gentle nucleus around which his ruthlessness revolved. As I stood there, trapped by his gaze and the weight of that forgotten book, I finally understood. I had shown compassion to a desperate boy, and in return, the king of the underworld had claimed my destiny as his own, securing me in a fortress built entirely out of memory and desire. The air in the penthouse, filtered and purified to a state of near non-existence, had begun to feel like a beautiful, polished coffin. It lacked the grit, the friction, the essential life of the outside world. I had spent 4 days moving within the cold, precise geometries of Dante's fortress, watching the city below like a prisoner examining a postcard. I was safe, yes, wrapped in an armor of devotion and intimidation, but the lack of resistance, the absolute perfection of my containment, was suffocating my spirit. I needed my own things. Not the silk and cashmere that Dante's staff provided, but the familiar weight of my worn wool coat, the scent of the specific Earl Grey tea I favored, and, most crucially, the physical presence of the boxes containing my dissertation notes, the last tangible link to the life I had been brutally yanked from. This necessity, however trivial, became my lifeline, the excuse I needed to demand a temporary reprieve from the gilded cage. I presented the request to Dante in the late afternoon. He was standing by the massive window, the city sprawling beneath him like a vanquished kingdom. He didn't turn immediately, but I felt his focus shift, heavy and absolute, pinning me to the floor. "It is unnecessary," he said, his voice a low, gravelly current. "Anything you require can be acquired." "It's not the objects themselves, Dante," I insisted, clutching my hands together. "It's the familiarity. My notes, they are specific. I need to retrieve them myself. I need an hour of my own dust." He turned then, his eyes dark as polished obsidian sweeping over me. He saw not the request for a coat, but the desperate plea for autonomy. The risk versus the necessity of maintaining my fragile cooperation. His reluctance was a physical thing, a tightening of the air. 1 hour, he conceded, the word heavy with proprietary warning. "But you will not be alone. You will not speak to anyone unnecessarily, and you will not, under any circumstances, leave the immediate proximity of my security detail. Within 15 minutes, the departure was orchestrated with a chilling military precision. The elevator descended not to the main lobby, but to a secure subterranean garage I hadn't known existed. I was escorted by 4 men, silent, formidable shadows who seemed carved from the same granite as Dante's inner walls. They moved with an efficiency that suggested they were ready to dismantle the world around me at a moment's notice. The vehicle was a black, armored Titan, impervious and soundproof. As we emerged onto the bustling city streets, the display of force was staggering. 2 identical black SUVs flanked us, their windows tinted to opaque obscurity. I was surrounded by a wall of devotion built on fear, and the realization made my stomach clench. The journey was short but profoundly unsettling. The familiar landmarks of my old neighborhood near the university campus, the worn brick buildings, the bustling cafe where I used to grade papers, looked strangely fragile, like cardboard cutouts about to be blown away by a sudden storm. The car stopped directly in front of the narrow, unremarkable entrance to my apartment building. My shadow, a man named Marcus, whose face was as impassive as stone, opened my door. The scent hit me instantly. The comforting, slightly stale aroma of old books, radiator heat, and the faint musk of chalk dust clinging to the fibers of my tweed coat hanging near the entryway. It was the scent of my former, safe, gentle life. As I stepped into the hallway, flanked by 2 towering men, the illusion of safety shattered completely. My neighbor, Mrs. Petrov, a stout, usually garrulous woman, was locking her door across the hall. She looked up, ready to offer a complaint about the noisy students, but the words died in her throat. Her eyes fixed not on me, but on the 2 silent, tailored behemoths who stood sentinel, blocking the weak afternoon light filtering through the landing window. The change in her face was instantaneous and visceral. It was not mere surprise. It was absolute, paralyzing terror. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she shrank back against her own doorway, her eyes wide and dark. She didn't dare speak, didn't dare breathe too loudly. She recognized, instinctively, the nature of the power that had entered her quiet, academic world. I realized in that sickening moment that I was contagious. My presence, wrapped in the visible manifestation of Dante's protection, was a harbinger of danger. I was no longer Alara Hale, the kind-hearted teacher with the messy hair and slightly frayed cuffs. I was Dante Moretti's woman, an entity touched by the underworld, and therefore untouchable and utterly terrifying. "Ilara," Marcus murmured, his voice a low, constant reminder of the ticking clock and the proximity requirement. I hurried into the small apartment. The space felt impossibly small now, cramped and vulnerable after the marble expanses of the penthouse. I collected the necessary items, the heavy box of annotated Milton, my favorite coat, a few sentimental photographs. Everything felt foreign, belonging to a ghost. As I worked, I heard the faint sound of movement from outside my door. My colleague, Professor Thorne, was passing by. He stopped, presumably seeing the 2 men, and started to speak, perhaps to ask if I was all right or to inquire about my sudden absence from the university. But before he could utter a word, Marcus took a single, deliberate step, turning his body just enough to convey an unspoken, crushing threat. Professor Thorne, a man who lectured daily on the moral imperatives of civic duty, froze. The color drained from his face. He averted his gaze instantly, turning his head as if he hadn't seen anything at all, and hurried down the stairs, his footsteps frantic and uneven. He was running from the sheer possibility of association. The realization settled over me with the weight of cold stone. My old life was irrevocably destroyed. Dante hadn't just rescued me. He had scorched the earth around me, ensuring that no one would ever dare approach me without first measuring the depths of his wrath. The fear I witnessed was not directed at me, but at the shadow of the man I now belonged to. I slammed the lid down on the final box, the sound echoing harshly in the small room. I didn't bother to clean, didn't feel the need for closure. There was nothing left to salvage here. I walked out of the apartment, the gentle teacher replaced by the dangerous cargo, and allowed the shadows to escort me back to the safety of the fortress. As the heavy, armored vehicle pulled away, leaving the silent, terrorized street behind, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. I had left the gilded cage, only to discover that the world outside was infinitely more terrifying, and that Dante Moretti's obsession had truly made me untouchable and utterly alone within the storm he had created. The scent of dust and old paper, so comforting in my small apartment, felt like an invasive foreign body here, clinging to the dry air of the penthouse. I was sitting on the floor of the secondary study, a room Dante rarely used, perhaps deemed too small at 40 square feet, surrounded by the cardboard boxes retrieved from my former life. The silence was sepulchral, broken only by the faint rasp of my fingers against the rough cardboard edges. I was sorting through the academic debris, the heavy tomes and annotated notes that had once defined my existence. Each book I touched felt like an artifact from a lost civilization. I lifted a volume of obscure 19th century German philosophy, intending to stack it neatly, when I noticed the anomaly. It was tucked deep within the box, resting not against the spine of the book, but nestled incongruously between the pages of the text block, near the center. It was a small, intricately carved trinket, a wooden bird. It was no larger than my thumb, rendered in a dark, polished wood, perhaps ebony, with sharp, defined feathers and a cruel, hooked beak. It was beautiful in a cold, precise way, yet it felt profoundly wrong. I had never owned anything like it. My possessions were worn, soft, and useful. This bird was ornate, deliberate, and utterly foreign. I turned it over in my palm. The weight was unsettling. My fingers, still unsteady from the lingering trauma, traced the delicate carving. As I ran my thumb over the bird's breast, I felt a minute seam, a hinge. My breath hitched, a cold knot forming beneath my ribs. With a trembling hand, I gently pressed the spot, and a tiny section of the bird's torso sprang open, revealing a hollow core. Inside, rolled tightly and secured with a thread thinner than hair, was a minuscule scroll of vellum. The paper was stiff and brittle, smelling faintly of something metallic. I picked at the thread until the paper unrolled, revealing a single mark rendered in black ink. It was not a letter or a number, but a symbol, a stylized double helix crossed with a jagged line, like lightning splitting a chain. It was an emblem of cruel, calculated geometry, speaking of organization and intent. The blood drained from my face, leaving my skin feeling like cold marble. The comforting assumption, the story I had clung to for sanity, that I had been the unfortunate victim of random street violence or even a clumsy attempt at payback against Dante, dissolved instantly. This was a signature. This was a message. This was the terrifying, undeniable proof that the attack had been planned, meticulously executed, and that I was not a chance encounter. I was chosen. The bird was planted. It was a misplaced piece of the puzzle, a calculated error left behind by someone who wanted Dante to know exactly who was coming for him. And they had used me, the gentle teacher, the forgotten girl from his past, as the delivery vessel. I stood abruptly, the sudden movement sending the boxes skittering. The pristine quiet of the penthouse felt suffocating, mocking my sudden rush of panic. I clutched the wooden bird and the tiny scroll in my hand, their unnatural coldness grounding me in the terrifying reality. I needed to see his face when he saw the symbol. I needed him to acknowledge the chilling truth that I was no longer just the object of his protection, but the pawn in his war. I found Dante in the main library, standing before a vast obsidian-colored map of the city etched into a wall panel. He was consulting with two men in dark suits, his inner circle, perhaps. Their conversation was low, intense, and focused entirely on logistics and retribution. I didn't pause for permission. I walked straight into the cold geometry of their meeting, the small, damning piece of evidence held out like a fragile weapon. The two men immediately ceased speaking and turned, their faces registering momentary confusion, then immediate, deferential apprehension as they recognized the intensity in my eyes. Dante turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over me. He dismissed his men with a barely perceptible flick of his wrist. They melted away instantly, leaving us alone in the cavernous room, the air vibrating with the unfinished tension of their strategy. "Ilara," he said, his voice measured, containing the latent power he rarely allowed to surface. "What is it?" I walked toward the antique desk, placing the wooden bird carefully on the polished surface, followed by the unrolled piece of vellum, the cryptic symbol facing him. My hand was shaking so violently I had to steady it against the oak. "I found this," I whispered, the sound strained and sharp, "in one of my textbooks, tucked inside the pages. I have never seen it before. It's not mine." Dante did not immediately touch the items. He looked at the intricately carved bird, then at the small, menacing symbol. The air around him suddenly grew heavy, thick with contained violence. His eyes, usually fierce, became dangerously still, like the surface of a frozen lake concealing abyssal depths. He leaned closer to the desk, his massive frame overshadowing the delicate evidence. His focus was absolute. I watched his jaw tighten, the muscle working beneath his sculpted cheekbone. He didn't need me to explain the symbol. The instant recognition in the depths of his eyes was a chilling confirmation. "It wasn't random, was it?" I pressed, the realization chilling me to the bone. This wasn't just a mugging or even a threat to repay an old debt. They planted this. They made sure I carried the message. They didn't choose me because I was weak, Dante. They chose me because I was yours. He finally reached out, his finger tracing the jagged line of the symbol, the gesture possessive and utterly grave. He lifted his gaze to mine, and the fury I saw there was terrifying, not directed at me, but at the architects of this calculated cruelty. "They knew who you were to me," he confirmed, his voice dropping to a low, guttural register that scraped against the silence. "They calculated the precise point of maximum vulnerability. They understood that the quickest way to cripple the king is to strike at the thing he cherishes most. The word cherishes should have warmed me, but it only amplified the cold dread. I was not a person with agency. I was a strategic target. I was the fragile hinge of his empire, and someone had tried to break me to shatter him. A pawn, I breathed, the word tasting like ash. I was the bait. You told me you would burn the city to protect me, but you knew, didn't you? You knew this was a declaration of war, and that I was standing on the front lines the moment you brought me here. Dante moved then, closing the space between us with 2 swift steps. He placed his large hands on my shoulders, his grip firm, anchoring me against the rising tide of hysteria. His intensity was a physical weight, crushing the fear but replacing it with the sharp reality of obsession. "You are not a pawn, Elara," he corrected, his eyes burning into mine. "You are the prize, and they just made the fatal mistake of letting me know who I am fighting. This changes nothing about my intent, only the scope of the destruction required. They chose you because they thought you were a weakness I would abandon. They were wrong." His proximity, the scent of expensive dark cologne and contained menace wrapped around me like a dangerous shroud. I saw the darkness in his eyes, the absolute certainty of the violence he was now ready to unleash. This was not the quiet, calculating strategist. This was the king of the underworld, unleashed by the perceived violation of his most sacred possession. The warmth of his hands was terrifying. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that the gentle life I had mourned was gone forever. I was trapped in a storm of vengeance and forbidden desire, a storm that had just been elevated from a skirmish to a siege. And I was the reason Dante Moretti was preparing to set the city alight. The air in the penthouse had changed from sterile quiet to something heavy and electrically charged, thick with the scent of dark coffee and contained vigilance. Since I had presented the wooden bird and the damning symbol, the fortress had locked down around me. I felt the shift not just in the atmosphere, but in the very geometry of the space. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the dusk deepen the shadows over the city far below. The glass, which had once felt like a barrier between my new life and the old, now felt like the impenetrable wall of an aquarium. I was visible, yet untouchable, wrapped in a security detail that had tripled overnight. I counted 2 new faces, men whose names I didn't know, who stood like silent, tailored statues near the elevator bank, their eyes moving with relentless, synchronized precision. Dante, too, had become a permanent fixture. He was no longer working in his private study. His operations had migrated to the large central living area, the space divided by an invisible line of control that centered on my presence. He was seated at a temporary, minimalist desk that looked wholly out of place against the silk rugs and antique furniture, his attention split between digital reports and the absolute awareness of my movements. He had not left the apartment since the night before, and the tension radiating from him was a palpable, low-frequency hum that vibrated in my chest. His protectiveness, once a comforting shield, had become a physical weight, pressing me down, restricting my breath. I felt watched when I walked to the kitchen, assessed when I sat down to read, and contained even when I simply stared out the window. The gilded cage had suddenly shrunk, and the gold bars felt like iron. I pushed away from the window, the sudden movement drawing Dante's immediate attention. His head snapped up, his gaze fixing on me with an intensity that demanded explanation for the simple act of walking. It was suffocating. "I need to walk," I stated, heading toward the long hallway that led only to the private gym and a rarely used guest suite. It was the only direction I could move that didn't immediately intersect with his workspace. "Stay within sight, Elara," Dante commanded, his voice devoid of inflection, a simple statement of fact, not a request. He didn't look back at his screen. His eyes followed me, tracking my progress down the long mirrored corridor. The immediate, crushing lack of autonomy finally shattered my restraint. I stopped 10 feet down the hall and turned back to face him, the polished marble floor gleaming between us like a dangerous river. "Don't you think I deserve to know?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly, not with fear, but with rising indignation. "You've locked me in here. You've turned this place into a literal fortress. I can't move, I can't breathe without your men watching me. I am the target, Dante. I am the messenger. I deserve to know who sent the message." He rose slowly from the desk. When he stood, he filled the space, transforming the luxurious room into a stark arena. The movement was measured, intimidating, the prelude to a storm. He walked toward me, his pace deliberate, until he stood just beyond arm's reach. "You know enough," he said, his voice dangerously low, the sound resonating with the effort it took him to remain calm. "You know that they are powerful. You know that they are ruthless. You know that they used you to find me." "That is not knowing, Dante. That is fear-mongering," I countered, taking a step closer, determined not to be cowed by the sheer force of his presence. "Is it the Russians? Is it a rival family? I am a woman who used to grade papers on the Romantic poets. I need the context. I need to understand the danger I represent to everyone around me." My last words hit a nerve. I saw the tremor of suppressed violence run through his shoulders, the momentary clenching of his fists. He looked at me, and his eyes were dark abysses, reflecting a depth of protective rage I had only glimpsed before. "The identity of the enemy is irrelevant to your current existence," he bit out, the words clipped and sharp. "It is a darkness you do not need to carry. Their names are poison. Their methods are filth. I am handling it." "By locking me away? By treating me like a priceless vase you're afraid to set down?" I challenged, suddenly desperate to break through the armor of his control. "You talk about burning the city for me, but you won't even grant me the dignity of the truth. Tell me, Dante, tell me the full extent of the danger, or this protection of yours is nothing more than obsession dressed up as devotion." The silence that followed was absolute, weighted by the unspoken accusation. I watched his face, a mask of sculpted granite, crumble around the edges. His emotional boundary, the meticulous wall he kept between his power and his vulnerability, had finally been breached. His control fractured, and the raw, terrifying force of his feeling poured out. He reached out, his hands moving quickly, not to grab, but to frame my face, his thumbs resting just beneath my cheekbones. His grip was firm, bordering on painful, holding me captive beneath the intense pressure of his gaze. "You want the truth?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, raw with a fear that was more devastating than any display of fury. "The truth is that you represent the single greatest failure of my life, Elara. The fact that they touched you, that they calculated your worth to me, is a wound that will never heal. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, the scent of expensive dark cologne and contained malice flooding my senses. His breath was warm against my skin. I have faced guns, knives, betrayal, and the constant threat of destruction since I was a boy, he confessed. The admission dragged from him like a physical pain. I have never feared death, not my own, not anyone else's. But the thought of losing you, of that calculated error succeeding, of them taking you from me, even just the memory of seeing you bruised and bleeding, that fear, Ilara, is a physical, suffocating terror. It is worse than death. It is the end of my world. His words were not a plea for understanding. They were a declaration of ownership, so absolute, so devastatingly honest, that it left me breathless. He wasn't guarding me for strategic reasons. He was guarding me because he physically could not bear the consequence of my absence. I had leverage, yes, the absolute, total leverage of being his worst fear realized. But the recognition of this power only tightened the invisible, gilded chains around me. I was not safe from him. I was trapped by him. He pulled back slightly, his eyes burning into mine, seeking confirmation, demanding understanding. I will not risk your life for the satisfaction of your curiosity. I will eliminate the threat, and I will do it from here. You stay, Ilara. You stay, because I cannot function without knowing you are safe. That is the truth. That is the extent of the danger you pose to me. The argument had ended, not with a resolution, but with a visceral confession of obsession. I understood then that my freedom was not just restricted by his security protocols, but by the overwhelming, dark necessity of his devotion. I was the core of his world, and he was ready to dismantle the reality outside these walls to ensure that core remained intact. The air was thick with the promise of vengeance and the terror of absolute, unrelenting love. The silence that fell after Dante's confession was not empty. It was saturated, thick with the weight of his absolute, terrifying commitment. I retreated to the sunroom, a space meant for quiet contemplation, but which now felt like a glass cage perched precariously on the edge of a precipice. The city lights far below were glittering smears of color, indifferent to the storm gathering above them, a storm whose epicenter was Dante Moretti and whose lightning rod was me. I settled onto a velvet chaise lounge, the fabric cool against my skin, trying to regulate my breathing. Dante remained in the living area, and though I could not see him, I felt his presence, a low, persistent pressure that mapped the geography of my fear and my sudden, dizzying power. He had confessed to me his mortal weakness, and in doing so, had bound us together with a chain forged of obsession and terror. The veneer of normalcy in the penthouse, however heavily guarded, was thin. It was a beautiful lie we were living, surrounded by priceless art and gilded ironwork, while the truth of the world, violence, vengeance, and shadow, waited just outside the reinforced steel doors. A soft knock broke the tense atmosphere. It was Marcus, one of Dante's oldest associates, a man whose quiet demeanor barely masked his lethal efficiency. He held a small, elegantly wrapped box, secured with a length of thick silver ribbon. It looked innocuous, like a gift meant for a birthday or a holiday. "Forgive the intrusion, Ilara," Marcus murmured, his tone polite yet watchful. "This arrived with the afternoon's supply delivery." It was addressed to you personally, and the delivery service confirmed it was a registered sender. My stomach clenched. In this fortress, nothing arrived without meticulous inspection. The fact that this package had been allowed past the primary screening suggested either a profound error or an incredible level of infiltration. Dante's security was built to repel tanks, not eliminate the chance of a common courier delivery. I took the box. It was cool and surprisingly heavy. My fingers trembled as I touched the ribbon. Did Mr. Moretti see this? He is aware of its arrival. He asked that you open it here, in the sunroom, Marcus replied, his eyes conveying the unspoken command that I was not to be left alone with the contents. He took a position near the arched entrance, becoming another silent, necessary statue. I placed the box on the glass-top table and slowly, deliberately, began to untie the silver knot. The paper was thick, textured, a deep shade of midnight blue. It smelled faintly of expensive parchment and something sharp, almost metallic. When the paper fell away, it revealed a simple, hinged wooden box, mahogany, polished to a deep sheen. There was no latch, only a tight seal. I ran a fingernail along the seam and lifted the lid. The air in the sunroom suddenly felt cold. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, were two items. The first was a photograph. It was faded, slightly creased at the edges, and instantly recognizable. It was a picture of me, taken 6 years ago, standing outside the elementary school where I used to teach. I was smiling genuinely, wearing a brightly colored scarf, holding a stack of children's drawings. It was a photograph that had hung on the corkboard in my small, sunlit kitchen for years. A kitchen located 3 neighborhoods away, in an apartment I had abandoned in terror. My hand shook violently as I picked it up. The image was so painfully ordinary, so representative of the life that was dead and buried. How had they gotten this? Had they broken into my old apartment? No, my landlord had confirmed the locks were changed and the unit was empty. This meant they had been watching me for a very long time, long before the attack, long before Dante. The second item lay beneath the photograph. It was a small, perfectly folded square of linen, and tucked inside the linen was a single dried leaf. It was the specific, delicate shape of a maple leaf, pressed flat and brittle with age. I knew this leaf. I had found it years ago, pressed between the pages of my favorite copy of Wuthering Heights, which I kept locked in a fireproof box tucked away at the very back of my closet in the old apartment. The cold, surgical precision of the invasion stole the breath from my lungs. This was not a message of generalized threat. This was a message that said, "We know exactly who you are, where you came from, and what you hold dear. We have breached your past, and your present sanctuary is an illusion." But the true violation was the note. Beneath the velvet liner, there was a sheet of thick cardstock. The message was written in elegant, looping script, starkly black against the white paper. It read, "Ilara, the silence is deafening. We hope the gilded cage is comfortable. The memory of your scarf is still vivid. Soon, the walls will not be enough to hold the storm." And beneath the chilling text, a final line, rendered in the same script. "Tell Dante we enjoyed the view from the 7th floor utility access. We wave goodbye." A strangled sound escaped me. The 7th floor! This penthouse was on the 35th. The note implied they had been inside the building, deep within Dante's territory, close enough to watch the elevators, close enough to observe the periphery of our lives. The sanctity of our hiding place, the one thing Dante had promised, had been breached, not by violence, but by calculated psychological cruelty. I felt the blood rush from my head, leaving me dizzy and nauseous. My fear was no longer the sharp panic of a victim, but the sickening dread of a soldier realizing the enemy controls the map. I looked up at Marcus, my eyes wide with the horrifying confirmation that the fortress was compromised. He stood utterly still, his face granite, but I saw the minute tightening around his mouth. He understood the gravity of the implied infiltration. I gripped the edge of the glass table, steadying myself, refusing to succumb to the urge to collapse. The gentle teacher, the woman who cried over bruised knees and sad poems, was gone. She had been assassinated by a brittle maple leaf and a photograph. I looked at the objects spread on the table. They had tried to shatter me, to remind me of my fragility, to make me a liability Dante would discard. But instead of fear, a terrible, cold clarity settled over me. Hiding was no longer an option. Passivity was a death sentence. If my life was now inextricably linked to Dante's war, I would no longer be a fragile prize waiting to be defended. I would be a combatant. I stood, pushing the chaise away, the movement abrupt and resolute. I gathered the photograph, the leaf, and the damning note, clutching them tightly. I walked out of the sunroom and back into the main living area, where Dante sat, alerted by Marcus's shift in posture. He was standing now, his face a mask of controlled fury, his eyes fixed on the evidence in my hands. I placed the items on his desk, arranging them like exhibits in a terrible trial. "They were here, Dante," I stated, my voice steady, stripped bare of emotion. "In the building. They know my past. They know where I kept my secrets. And they know exactly how to hurt you through me." I met his gaze, the dark intensity of his eyes mirroring the resolve hardening in my own heart. The gilded ironwork had not protected me. His fierce devotion had only made me a clearer target. If I was to survive this siege, I had to stop fearing the war and start learning how to fight within it. I would not allow myself to be the reason for his destruction. I would not be the weakness he abandoned. "Tell me the truth, Dante," I demanded, leaning over the desk, the soft teacher replaced by a woman forged in fire. "Tell me everything about them. I am not leaving, and I will not be a liability. I need to know how to use the weapons you have given me." The mahogany desk felt cold beneath my hands, a vast, polished expanse separating the remnants of my gentle past, the wilted maple leaf and the faded photograph, from the terrible, living necessity of the present. Dante stood opposite me, his initial fury having calcified into a dangerous stillness. He looked like a statue carved from obsidian, poised for inevitable destruction. "You want the truth of the war, Ilara?" he finally asked, his voice a low, grating sound that vibrated the air between us. "Then you must understand the cost. I cannot give you names, because those names carry a burden of history that would drown you. But I can give you the current calculus. They want me broken, and they believe the fastest way to achieve that is to destroy the things I protect." He reached out, his finger tracing the edge of the photograph, my smiling, naive face against the backdrop of St. Jude's Elementary. The movement was a quiet acknowledgement of the brutal fact. I was the weapon, and my past was the trigger. Before he could elaborate, the room was shattered by a sharp electronic chime. Marcus, still stationed by the sunroom entrance, spoke urgently into a hidden comm-piece. Dante didn't wait for the report. He simply looked at Marcus, reading the disaster in the set of the man's jaw. "The confirmation?" Dante asked, his eyes never leaving mine, as if preparing me for the blow. "Confirmed, Mr. Moretti." A diversionary fire alarm and a subsequent call reporting an unattended package left in the teacher's lounge. The location is St. Jude's. The time frame is calculated to hit the after-school program dismissal. My breath hitched, sharp and painful. St. Jude's, my old school, the place where the scent of chalk dust and freshly sharpened pencils was synonymous with innocence. Now it was a crucible. They weren't targeting me, not directly. They were targeting the ghost of the woman I used to be, aiming to taint the last piece of sanctity I held dear, hoping the inevitable chaos would force Dante into the open. "They are using children," I whispered, the horror rising in my throat, tasting like ash. The abstract threat had become concrete, vile, and immediate. Dante moved then, turning toward the bank of screens that had been installed discreetly into the wall paneling. His body language shifted from contained vigilance to focused, lethal efficiency. They miscalculated. They assumed you would collapse, Elara. They assumed I would be forced into a tactical response of panic. "No," I said, walking around the desk, ignoring the silent barrier that his power usually erected. I stood beside him, looking at the grainy aerial maps flashing across the screens. They assumed right about the target. That building is a brick warren. The main entrance is obvious, but there's a back alley access for deliveries, and the basement fire escape leads directly to the boiler room. If they planted something, they would use the boiler room. It's the blind spot for the city's security cameras. Dante stopped monitoring his communications and looked down at me, his expression a complicated mixture of shock and intense, possessive satisfaction. My knowledge, the mundane, useless details of my former life, had just become strategic intelligence. "The delivery alley is tight," I continued, my mind racing, mapping the familiar streets. "It's only wide enough for one van. If you send in armored cars, they'll get bottlenecked. But there's a municipal parking garage 2 blocks away, on 14th Street. You can stage your men there and approach on foot, through the park bordering the south side. The fence is broken near the old oak tree. No one ever fixed it." I was speaking the language of his war, giving him the precise, ugly details he needed to protect my past. I felt no remorse. The gentle teacher was giving way to the strategist, trading compassion for casualty control. "The oak tree," Dante repeated, the phrase dark and foreign on his tongue. He pressed a button on a secure phone. "Marcus, relay the staging plan. Focus on the south perimeter fence near the municipal lot. Avoid the main entrance. I want 3 teams moving into position now. No shots fired unless absolutely necessary. Priority is securing the building and neutralizing the device." The penthouse instantly came alive with controlled chaos. The silent statues near the elevator mobilized, their tailored suits suddenly emphasizing their lethal grace. Dante didn't leave, not yet. He stayed rooted beside me, orchestrating the swift, surgical response from the high-rise command center. The storm was unleashed, and I was watching it from the eye. I retreated to the enormous window overlooking the city. The lights below, which had seemed indifferent earlier, now felt like markers on a deadly game board. I watched the movement, subtle shifts in traffic flow, the sudden absence of pedestrians on certain streets. the invisible signature of Dante's power deploying. He stood behind me a moment later, his presence a wall of heat and dark intent. He didn't touch me, but the air was thick with the silent understanding he was leaving. He had to monitor the operation from the field, or at least from a closer vantage point, to ensure the safety of the innocents I had just defended. "I am going down to the surveillance floor," he stated, his voice flat. "I can watch the perimeter there. You will stay here. Marcus and 2 men will remain on this floor. Do not move from this room, Ilara." His command was absolute, but the fear in his eyes was still there, the fear that I represented his undoing. He was fighting a war for my safety, but he was fighting a deeper battle against the impulse to lock me in a vault and throw away the key. As he turned to leave, a wave of sickening clarity washed over me. I wasn't just observing the darkness, I was participating in it. Every child saved, every maneuver executed, was predicated on the ruthless efficiency of the man beside me. I was choosing this. I was choosing him. I reached out, my hand closing around the expensive fabric of his suit jacket before he could take a step toward the elevator. The material felt strong and smooth, a stark contrast to the coiled tension of his body. He stopped, slowly turning back to face me. The cathedral of glass reflecting the city lights seemed to shatter around us, leaving only the dark intensity of our connection. "Go," I told him, my voice steady, no longer trembling with either indignation or fear. "Go," I told him. "But know this, Dante. I am not the soft, fragile thing you are protecting. I gave you the map. I chose the path." I took a step closer, closing the final distance, pressing my body against his. The immediate violence of his world, the gunfire, the hidden blades, the calculated threat, was happening now in the streets below, and I was wrapping myself in the knowledge that he was the storm, and I was willing to be its eye. "Do whatever you need to do to end this," I whispered, looking up into his face, accepting the harsh lines of his power, the terrible beauty of his obsession. "But when you return, understand that I am no longer waiting on the gilded sidelines. I am standing in the shadow of your violence. I accept the cost of choosing you." His control finally snapped. He crushed me against him, his arms closing around my back with a desperate, almost painful force, burying his face in my hair. It was a raw, silent confession of the relief that I had finally, fully stepped across the line. He pulled back, his eyes burning with a terrifying, absolute devotion that promised vengeance for the world and eternal protection for me. He didn't speak another word. He released me, turned, and walked toward the elevator, disappearing into the dark, obsidian current of his war, leaving me alone in the high, silent room, a queen who had just commanded her king to spill blood for her crown. The dawn arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a clinical, silver intrusion. It bleached the color from the vast, empty living room, revealing the dust motes dancing in the cold light and casting the gilded ironwork into stark, unforgiving relief. The violence, though executed miles away, still seemed to cling to the air in the penthouse, a residue of adrenaline and fear that refused to dissipate, even after the operation concluded. I stood by the window where I had watched the invisible currents of his war flow across the city grid. The silence now was a physical pressure, heavy and complete, broken only by the distant, muffled cadence of the city waking up, a sound that felt profoundly alien to the quiet brutality of the last few hours. My limbs were leaden, the exhaustion of the adrenaline crash making my bones ache. The strategic clarity that had guided me hours before had evaporated, replaced by a terrible, hollow clarity. I had traded innocence for efficacy. I looked down at my hands. They were steady now, but the memory of them pointing to the boiler room, outlining the broken fence, giving the location of the enemy's blind spot, was etched into my consciousness. I had not pulled the trigger, but I had provided the coordinates. The gentle teacher was dead, assassinated not by the enemy, but by the necessity of survival, and the killer was the woman looking back at me in the glass reflection. Marcus had returned hours ago, his face grim but confirming success. The children were safe. The threat was neutralized. Dante had returned shortly after, a ghost moving through the apartment, giving sharp, quiet orders before retreating into his private sanctuary, the study, to deal with the paperwork of vengeance. I had given him space, allowing him the necessary ritual of cleansing himself of the fight, but now the weight had become unbearable. I needed to see the cost of the victory I had helped engineer. I walked away from the light, following the familiar path toward the back wing of the penthouse. The air grew heavier here, scented with rich, old leather and the faint metallic tang of cigar smoke, the scent of his power. I paused at the threshold of the study. The door was a heavy slab of polished walnut, usually imposing, but tonight it felt like the entrance to a crypt. I pushed the door open without knocking. The room was dim, lit only by a single focused desk lamp that illuminated a chaos of files, maps, and secure communications gear. Dante was seated behind the sprawling mahogany desk, his posture slumped, every line of his body expressing profound, overwhelming fatigue. He wore a fresh, dark shirt, but the weariness in his face was deeper than the dirt of the street. His hair was slightly disheveled, and the shadow of stubble darkened the fierce angles of his jaw. He looked less like the untouchable king of the city and more like a warrior who had fought through the night and was now counting the dead. He didn't look up immediately, his eyes fixed on a thick file, but he knew I was there. The air shifted, recognizing my presence, the only fragile, living thing in this fortress built for war. "Ilara," he stated, the word deep and rough, carrying the gravel of exhaustion. He finally lifted his gaze. I saw the victory there, cold and absolute, but also the deep reservoir of pain, the price of his absolute vigilance. He was battered, not physically, but spiritually, having just commanded the inevitable violence necessary to protect me. I walked toward the desk, ignoring the thick carpet and the priceless antiques that lined the walls. My focus was only on him. I stopped a few feet away, placing my hands flat on the cool, unforgiving surface of the wood. "You are safe," he said, his voice dropping lower, a command and a promise all at once. "They will not breach this sanctuary again. They lost too much tonight." "I know," I replied, my voice steady, perhaps steadier than it had ever been. "I saw the maps. I saw the deployment. I understand the calculation. They lost because they underestimated the violence you would unleash to protect the memory of my old life." I took a breath. The decision that had been brewing since I saw the photograph in the sunroom finally crystallizing into an unshakable resolve. The simple life I had loved, the life of bright scarves and children's laughter, was gone. Mourning, it was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had chosen the darkness when I gave him the map, and now I would claim my place in the shadow. I am not here to thank you for the protection, Dante, I continued, leaning slightly closer, forcing him to meet the intensity of my gaze. I am here to tell you that I accept the terms of this exchange. My life as a simple teacher is over. It was a beautiful lie, and the truth is that I belong here, in the cold, gray reality of your world. His eyes widened fractionally, a minuscule shift that betrayed the shock beneath his exhaustion. He had expected gratitude, perhaps fear, but not this cold, calculated acceptance of our shared path. I know what this bond is, I whispered, the words an oath sworn in the half-light of dawn. It is forbidden. It is morally corrupt. It is built on vengeance, sustained by obsession, and secured by the promise of absolute, lethal protection. But when I was waiting tonight, watching the ghost of my past life burn, I realized this intensity, this terrifying certainty, is the only life I want now. I will not be a captive. I will be the core of your world, Dante, the reason for the fire, the reason for the darkness. I reached across the files and the maps, my fingers brushing the back of his hand. It was rough, scarred, and impossibly strong. The hand that had just commanded the city's destruction for my sake. I felt the surge of cold commitment, the realization that my love for him was not a light to save him, but an anchor to hold him firmly in the abyss. He pushed the files aside with a swift, violent motion, rising from the chair. He came around the desk, his massive frame eclipsing the desk lamp, plunging me into his shadow. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His victory had been bought with blood, and my acceptance was the final seal on the contract. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of exhaustion beneath my eyes. His touch was reverent, yet possessive, acknowledging the shift that had just taken place. I had offered him my soul, fully understanding that he would guard it ruthlessly, and that in doing so, he would damn us both. "The abyss is absolute, Ilara," he murmured, his voice a promise and a warning. "There is no return from this choice." "Then let us sink together," I replied, leaning into his hands, closing my eyes, and accepting the finality of the fall. I wrapped my own arms around his waist, pulling his weary, powerful body against mine. I was no longer afraid of the darkness, he commanded. I was terrified of a world where I did not belong solely to him, protected by the terrible, beautiful storm of his obsession. The gentle teacher was truly dead, and in her place, a woman forged in the shadows had risen, ready to reign at the side of her king.